What if a thousand-year-old German dynasty still shaped your world today? Imagine a power so influential, its echoes resonate hundreds of years later. The Staufer rulers, often overlooked, were master shapers of an era, and their impact didn't just end with them. Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and join me as we uncover their astonishing, enduring legacy woven into the very fabric of our modern world. The story of the Staufer Dynasty begins in the rugged hills of Swabia, a region in what is now southwestern Germany. They emerged from a cluster of ambitious local lords who were once indistinguishable from the many noble families that populated the medieval landscape. Yet, through shrewd alliances, military strength, and a clear sense of destiny, they transformed themselves into one of the most powerful ruling houses of medieval Europe. Their story spans centuries of struggle and ambition, a tale of both triumph and downfall. In 2025, their legacy continues to matter because their era laid the groundwork for many of the ideas that shaped Europe's political, cultural, and legal traditions. Understanding the Staufers is to understand how power, belief, and identity evolved in a time when Europe was still defining itself. The Staufers were first known simply as the Lords of Staufen, named after their ancestral castle perched above the Watch Valley. In an age when loyalty to the emperor was both a burden and an opportunity, they attached themselves to the imperial cause early on. Their fortunes rose in part because they served the reigning emperors faithfully, gaining lands and influence as a reward. What set them apart was their ability to see beyond the local and think imperially. They did not want to remain regional nobles. They wanted to shape the destiny of the Holy Roman Empire. That ambition drove them to seek marriages that connected them to other powerful dynasties, to fight for control of disputed lands, and to navigate the complex web of loyalty and rivalry that defined the empire. The Staufers' rise began in earnest with Conrad, a figure who understood how to blend diplomacy with force. He secured the Duchy of Swabia through marriage and laid the groundwork for the dynasty's later expansion. From this position, his descendants gained a foothold in imperial politics. When the time came for the German princes to choose an emperor, they did not overlook the Staufers. Their combination of regional power and imperial loyalty made them a natural choice in an era when the throne was often contested. Thus began the transformation of a Swabian family into the rulers of one of Europe's greatest empires. Their rule over the Holy Roman Empire marked a turning point in medieval history. The Staufers did not just inherit the empire, they tried to define it. They saw it as more than a collection of lands loosely united under a crown. They envisioned it as a true Christian empire that balanced divine authority with earthly governance. The Holy Roman Empire, sprawling across much of Central Europe, was an entity that demanded constant negotiation between emperor, pope, princes, and cities. The Staufers embraced this challenge with energy and confidence, but also with a sense of grandeur that often brought them into conflict with the papacy. The best known of the Staufers, Frederick Barbarossa, embodied this imperial ideal more than anyone else. His reign was marked by both bold vision and relentless struggle. Barbarossa believed that the emperor was chosen by God to restore order and justice to Christendom. He saw himself as heir to the Roman Caesars, a ruler whose authority came from divine will rather than papal approval. This belief led him into a long and bitter struggle with the popes of his time, who claimed that spiritual authority outranked imperial power. The conflict between emperor and pope became one of the defining struggles of the medieval world, and Barbarossa stood at its center. Barbarossa's charisma and leadership made him one of the most admired figures of his age. He sought to restore the dignity of the empire through law, reform, and military strength. His campaigns in Italy aimed to assert imperial rights over the rich northern cities, which had grown increasingly independent. Yet his efforts to bring them under control sparked resistance and rebellion. The Lombard League, a coalition of Italian cities, stood against him. Despite his victories, he learned that power in Italy was more fragile than it seemed. His attempts to rule there directly drained resources and strained his relationship with the German princes, who grew weary of financing endless wars in the south. Still, Barbarossa's vision of empire left a deep mark. He worked to codify laws and strengthen the authority of imperial institutions. He promoted a sense of shared purpose among the German nobility, encouraging them to see the empire as more than a battleground for personal ambition. He also understood the power of image and legend. His red beard became a symbol of strength and continuity. Even after his death during the Third Crusade, when he drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, he was remembered as a sleeping emperor who would one day return to restore Germany's glory. The myth of Barbarossa sleeping beneath the Kyffhauser Mountains still survives in folklore, a reminder of how deeply his image is rooted in the cultural memory of Europe. Frederick Barbarossa's grandson, Frederick II, brought the Staufer legacy to its highest point and its breaking point. Born in the south of Italy, he was raised in the diverse and cosmopolitan court of Sicily, where Greek, Arab, and Latin cultures mingled. His upbringing shaped him into one of the most remarkable rulers of the Middle Ages. He spoke several languages, corresponded with scholars and scientists, and encouraged learning in a way that was rare for a medieval monarch. His court at Palermo became a center of intellectual life, where ideas from the Islamic world met the traditions of Western Christendom. He promoted poetry, science, and philosophy, laying early foundations for the spirit of curiosity that would later blossom in the Renaissance. Frederick II's reign was driven by both vision and contradiction. He was a man of reason in an age of faith, a ruler who admired logic and science yet wielded absolute power. He issued laws that limited feudal abuses and sought to bring uniformity to his realm. His constitutions of Melfi were among the earliest attempts to create a centralized legal code in medieval Europe. He valued learning not as decoration, but as a tool for governance. To him, knowledge was power, and he surrounded himself with advisors who could help him rule with both wisdom and efficiency. Yet Frederick's relationship with the Church was even more fraught than his grandfather's. The popes saw him as a threat not only to their political power, but to their moral authority. They accused him of heresy and disbelief, portraying him as the Antichrist. Part of this fear stemmed from his willingness to negotiate with Muslims during the Crusades. Unlike other rulers who saw the Crusades purely as holy wars, Frederick approached them as political and diplomatic enterprises. His Sixth Crusade achieved its goal without bloodshed. Through negotiation, he regained control of Jerusalem for a time. To his critics, this was a betrayal of Christian zeal. To modern eyes, it looks like an act of foresight. Frederick II's ambitions extended across Europe. He sought to unify his vast empire, stretching from the North Sea to Sicily, under a single vision of enlightened monarchy. But this very ambition alarmed the German princes and the papacy alike. The empire was not a centralized state, but a patchwork of semi-independent territories, each with its own privileges. Frederick's efforts to impose order threatened the delicate balance of autonomy that held the realm together. His long absences in Italy weakened his hold on Germany, and his attempts to strengthen royal authority met resistance. The papacy responded by excommunicating him multiple times and rallying his enemies. In his later years, he faced rebellion and betrayal from his own family and vassals. When Frederick II died in the mid-13th century, the Staufer dream began to unravel. His sons tried to carry on his legacy, but they lacked his vision and strength. The empire entered a period of chaos, known as the Great Interregnum, when no single ruler could command authority across its vast lands. The papacy worked actively to dismantle the Staufer inheritance, supporting rival claimants and ensuring that the imperial crown would no longer be a threat to its dominance. The dynasty that had once seemed destined to rule forever was extinguished within a few generations. Even in their downfall, the Staufers left behind a legacy that shaped Europe's future. They had demonstrated both the potential and the limits of medieval monarchy. Their struggles with the papacy defined the boundaries between secular and religious authority for centuries to come. Their reforms in law and administration anticipated later developments in European governance. Their patronage of learning and culture helped keep alive the spirit of intellectual inquiry that would later flourish in the Renaissance. The idea of the emperor as a guardian of justice and order, rather than merely a warlord, owed much to their reign. In modern times, the Staufers have continued to fascinate historians, writers, and political thinkers. In 19th-century Germany, they were rediscovered as symbols of national unity. Romantic thinkers saw in Barbarossa the embodiment of a lost age of greatness, and his legend became a metaphor for Germany's hope of renewal. Statues, operas, and paintings revived his image as the ideal German ruler who would awaken when his people needed him most. Frederick II, on the other hand, appealed to those who valued reason, tolerance, and cultural curiosity. He was seen as a forerunner of the modern spirit, a ruler who looked beyond the narrow limits of his age. In 2025, the Staufer Dynasty still matters not because of nostalgia, but because their story captures the timeless struggle between ambition and responsibility. They remind us how power can inspire vision, yet also sow destruction. Frederick Barbarossa's belief in the divine mission of empire speaks to the dangers and allure of absolute authority. Frederick II's fascination with knowledge and governance reflects the enduring tension between idealism and pragmatism in leadership. Both men tried to reconcile faith and reason, empire and individuality, in ways that still resonate in our own political and cultural debates. Their world was vastly different from ours, yet the questions they faced remain familiar. How should power be used? Can an empire or a state balance unity with diversity? What happens when vision collides with the realities of human nature? The Staufers grappled with these questions not in theory, but in the harsh arena of medieval politics. Their answers were imperfect, sometimes tragic, yet profoundly influential. They lived in an age when belief in destiny shaped every decision, but they also helped redefine what destiny meant. The ruins of their castles still dot the landscapes of Germany and Italy. In those stones lies a silent memory of their ambition. The Kyffhäuser monument, built centuries later, still honors Barbarossa's legend, while scholars continue to study Frederick II's writings and laws. Museums, universities, and local communities in regions once ruled by the Staufers preserve their memory as part of a shared European heritage. Their story continues to attract interest because it connects the medieval past with modern reflections on governance, identity, and the pursuit of greatness. The Staufers' rise and fall reveal the fragile balance between personal ambition and the greater good. They built empires, but they also left lessons about the cost of overreaching. In their pursuit of power, they illuminated what it means to lead and what it means to lose. From the rugged hills of Swabia to the palaces of Palermo, their journey traced the full arc of human aspiration. The dynasty began with the hope of shaping history and ended as a legend that shaped memory. Even now, centuries later, their legacy invites us to look back not only with admiration but with reflection on how the drive for greatness can both build and destroy. The Staufers remain more than historical figures. They are a mirror of enduring human desires. They sought glory, justice, and understanding in a world as complex as our own. Their story is not just about medieval kings and wars, but about ambition itself, the force that drives civilizations forward and the weight that can bring them down. That is why in 2025, their tale still speaks to us. It is a reminder that history's greatest empires were built not only on power, but on vision, and that every age of ambition, whether in the past or in our present, carries within it both the light of creation and the shadow of decline. The story of the Staufer Dynasty does not end with their downfall. Though their power faded, their ideas and institutions outlived them, shaping the foundations of what would become modern Germany. The echoes of their rule are found not only in the ruins of their castles or the legends that bear their name, but in the deeper structures of governance, law, culture, and urban life that endured long after their empire collapsed. The Staufers were more than medieval rulers. They were architects of order in a world struggling to rise from the shadows of feudal fragmentation. Their ambitions left behind a framework for political and cultural development that still resonates in the heart of Europe. In their time, the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of territories, each ruled by local princes, bishops, or free cities. Central authority was weak, and loyalty often depended on personal bonds rather than legal or institutional ties. The Staufers recognized that such a system could not sustain an empire that aspired to universal rule. They sought to build a more stable foundation, one that relied not merely on personal allegiance, but on law and administration. This ambition led them to introduce practices that would gradually transform the relationship between ruler and realm. Their reforms were not modern in a literal sense, yet they laid down patterns of governance that later generations would refine and adapt. Frederick Barbarossa played a crucial role in this transformation. He believed that an empire needed structure as much as spirit. His vision was not just about conquering lands, but about creating order within them. One of his most lasting contributions was his effort to define and codify imperial authority. He sought to restore the old Roman concept of law as a foundation for governance. To him, justice was the essence of rulership. His government began to rely on written records, official seals, and formal legal procedures, which gave greater continuity and predictability to the administration of power. This was a departure from the earlier reliance on oral agreements and feudal customs. It marked a shift toward a bureaucratic mentality that would, centuries later, become a defining trait of German administration. Barbarossa's reign saw the strengthening of imperial courts as centers of legal interpretation. He surrounded himself with trained clerks and jurists who understood both Roman and canon law. These men, often educated in the universities of Bologna and Paris, brought to the empire the intellectual tools of legal reasoning that had been rediscovered in Europe. Through their work, imperial decrees began to resemble the formal statutes of later states. This evolution fostered a sense of continuity between ruler and law, suggesting that authority flowed not only from divine sanction, but also from established legal norms. It was a subtle but profound shift that would echo through the centuries. In his dealings with cities and princes, Barbarossa also established precedents for negotiation and compromise. The empire's complexity forced him to develop mechanisms for balancing competing interests. His charters to cities, while reaffirming imperial authority, also granted rights and privileges that encouraged local self-governance. This policy helped stabilize regions that might otherwise have rebelled, and it recognized that cooperation could be more effective than coercion. Many German towns trace their early charters and municipal rights back to this period. The concept of imperial cities, loyal directly to the emperor rather than to local lords, arose under his rule and provided a model of urban autonomy that endured for centuries. These cities would later become centers of trade, culture, and political thought, forming the backbone of what we now recognize as German civic life. Frederick II carried this administrative vision even further. His experience ruling Sicily exposed him to a sophisticated bureaucratic system influenced by Arab and Byzantine traditions. He absorbed these lessons and applied them throughout his domains. In his Italian territories, he established a centralized administration that monitored taxes, trade, and justice with a precision that was rare for the time. His Constitutions of Melfi, often considered one of the first modern legal codes, organized the realm into a hierarchy of offices and defined the responsibilities of each. The idea that the ruler's authority should be expressed through written law, administered by professional officials rather than feudal barons, represented a remarkable advance in political thought. Although these reforms were most effective in the south, their spirit influenced German territories as well. Frederick II's court became a laboratory for governance. He understood that power could not rest on might alone. It required knowledge and organization. His officials were often selected for competence rather than noble birth, setting a precedent for merit-based service. Records were carefully kept, correspondence was maintained in multiple languages, and communication networks spanned his empire. This administrative precision foreshadowed the bureaucratic efficiency that would later characterize German governance. It was an early recognition that order arises not only from hierarchy, but from structure and information. The Staufers' influence on administration extended beyond their own lifetimes because they helped shift the medieval world's perception of rulership. They demonstrated that authority could be rationalized, that a ruler could govern through laws and institutions rather than through personal dominance. Even after their dynasty fell, later emperors and regional princes built on these foundations. The legal and administrative traditions they fostered evolved into the systems that would underpin the German states of the early modern period and eventually the unified nation centuries later. Their legacy can be seen in the meticulous record-keeping, legal formalism, and respect for procedure that remain hallmarks of German political culture. Alongside their administrative achievements, the Staufers presided over one of the most vibrant periods of cultural development in medieval Europe. Their courts, particularly in Sicily and Swabia, became crossroads of ideas where scholars, poets, artists, and scientists found patronage and freedom to explore. In a world often dominated by war and religion, the Staufer rulers created spaces where learning and creativity could flourish. This cultural flowering not only enriched their time, but also left traces that continue to shape Europe's artistic and intellectual identity. Frederick II's Sicilian court was unlike any other in Europe. Influenced by the coexistence of Latin, Greek, Arab, and Jewish traditions, it embraced diversity as a source of strength. Scholars translated texts from Arabic into Latin, making available to the West the scientific and philosophical knowledge of the Islamic world. Astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy all advanced under his patronage. The emperor himself took a personal interest in science. He conducted experiments on animal behavior and corresponded with intellectuals across the Mediterranean. His curiosity reflected a spirit of inquiry that prefigured the Renaissance, and his court became a bridge between classical learning and the emerging modern outlook. In literature, the Staufers nurtured what became known as the Sicilian school of poetry, which transformed the vernacular language into a vehicle for artistic expression. Poets at Frederick's court wrote in a refined form of Italian, developing themes of love, virtue, and human experience that would later influence figures such as Dante Alighieri. Their use of local language rather than Latin was a significant step toward the creation of national literatures. It reflected a broader cultural shift that valued personal voice and emotion alongside religious devotion. The same movement took root in German-speaking lands, where the courtly poetry of the Minnesänger celebrated chivalry and romantic ideals. These works, often composed in the courts of Swabia and Austria, expressed a growing sense of identity and artistry that helped define medieval German culture. Architecture also flourished under the Staufers, blending Romanesque solidity with early Gothic grace. Their castles and cathedrals were not merely fortresses or churches, but statements of power and belief. The imperial cathedral at Speyer, expanded during their reign, stood as a monument to both faith and imperial majesty. In southern Italy, Frederick II's Castel del Monte exemplified the fusion of geometry, symbolism, and artistry that characterized his rule. Its octagonal design and precise proportions suggest not only architectural brilliance, but also intellectual ambition. These structures reflected a worldview that sought harmony between order and beauty, between the earthly and the divine. Music, too, found new expression in this period. Courtly life fostered a culture of performance where troubadours and musicians played vital roles. The blending of Germanic, Latin, and Mediterranean influences created melodies that transcended regional boundaries. Through these arts, the Stauffer courts helped cultivate a sense of cultural sophistication that endured long after their political power waned. They laid the groundwork for a tradition of artistic excellence that became integral to German and European identity. The cultural openness of the Stauffers was not limited to the elite. Their patronage indirectly stimulated urban culture by fostering trade, literacy, and communication. Cities became not just centers of commerce, but also of learning and craftsmanship. The intellectual and artistic energy of their courts spilled into urban workshops, schools, and guilds. The result was a gradual elevation of civic life, where citizens began to see themselves as participants in a shared cultural enterprise. The rise of universities, the growth of book production, and the spread of new architectural styles all drew momentum from this environment. Equally important was the Stauffer contribution to the development of towns and cities. During their rule, Germany began to shift from a predominantly rural society to one increasingly defined by urban centers. The Stauffers recognized the economic and strategic value of cities. They encouraged their growth by granting privileges such as the right to hold markets, build fortifications, and govern through elected councils. These rights gave cities a measure of autonomy that allowed them to prosper. The imperial charters they issued became models for municipal governance across the German lands. This policy of supporting urban development was both pragmatic and visionary. The Stauffers understood that thriving cities strengthened the empire's economic base and provided counterweights to the power of feudal lords. Merchants, craftsmen, and guilds brought wealth and stability, while fortified towns offered defense against invasion and rebellion. The pattern of city planning that emerged under their influence reflected a careful balance between order and flexibility. Streets were laid out with a sense of purpose, marketplaces became focal points of civic life, and churches anchored the spiritual heart of the community. Many medieval German towns still retain layouts that trace their origins to this period, where practicality and symbolism intertwined. The architecture of these cities reflected both imperial ambition and local pride. Town halls, guild buildings, and cathedrals rose as symbols of collective identity. Stone replaced wood as the primary material for public buildings, signifying permanence and confidence. Urban design incorporated open squares for gatherings and festivals, creating spaces where community life could flourish. This emphasis on public space foreshadowed later developments in European civic culture. The sense of belonging to a community governed by laws rather than by feudal authority marked a decisive step toward modern civic consciousness. The Stauffer encouragement of urban life also promoted social mobility. Cities offered opportunities for people of talent and industry to rise beyond the constraints of birth. Merchants and craftsmen could achieve status through skill and enterprise, and educated clerks could find positions within the growing administrative apparatus. This early form of meritocracy, while limited, hinted at the broader transformations that would shape Europe in later centuries. The urban economy stimulated trade routes that connected the German interior with the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and beyond. In this way, the Staufers helped weave Germany into the larger fabric of European commerce. Even after their dynasty ended, the urban policies they initiated continued to shape German life. The self-governing cities of the Holy Roman Empire became centers of innovation, finance, and education. They nurtured the values of diligence, precision, and civic responsibility that would later define German society. The emphasis on local autonomy and collective governance laid the foundation for the federal structures that characterize modern Germany. The Staufers, perhaps unknowingly, had set in motion a pattern of development that combined central authority with regional vitality. Their vision of rule, culture, and community did not disappear with their political collapse. It transformed into legacy. The legal rationality of Barbarossa, the intellectual curiosity of Frederick II, and the civic dynamism of their cities all merged into a broader European inheritance. The German lands that emerged from the turmoil of the late Middle Ages carried within them the seeds planted by the Staufers. Universities like Heidelberg and Leipzig, the Hanseatic League's trading cities, and even the later Prussian administrative tradition all owed something to the groundwork they had laid. By the time modern Germany began to take shape, the influence of the Staufers was deeply embedded in its institutions. The emphasis on law, order, education, and civic pride that characterized their era remained part of the national character. Their blend of intellectual ambition and disciplined governance found echoes in later reformers, philosophers, and statesmen. The idea that power should serve reason, that culture enriches strength, and that cities embody the spirit of a people continued to guide German development through the centuries. In the 21st century, when Europe seeks to balance unity with diversity, the lessons of the Stauffer age still hold meaning. They remind us that good governance requires both vision and structure, that culture thrives when curiosity is welcomed, and that cities are not just places to live, but expressions of collective identity. The Stauffers built their empire on ambition, but they sustained it through organization and imagination. Their administrative reforms provided stability, their cultural patronage nurtured creativity, and their urban policies fostered community. These achievements did more than shape medieval Germany. They helped define the principles that would one day underpin the modern nation. The dynasty's story, once marked by conquest and conflict, endures as a legacy of creation. The Stauffers may have fallen, but the world they imagined continues to live on in the systems, ideas, and spaces that still define German life. Their reign stands as a bridge between the medieval and the modern, between the age of ambition and the age of order. In the laws that uphold justice, in the cities that hum with life, and in the enduring respect for learning and culture, the spirit of the Stauffers still breathes. It connects the past to the present, a quiet reminder that greatness, when rooted in vision and discipline, can outlast the power that first gave it life. The legacy of the Staufer dynasty cannot be measured merely by the territories they ruled or the wars they fought. Their most lasting influence lies in the institutions, laws, and symbols they left behind. Though the dynasty ended centuries ago, its mark on the German world endures through the language of law, the structure of governance, and even the imagery of authority. The Stauffers did not only rule an empire, they imagined one. Their concept of order, justice, and power outlived their political line and became part of the foundation on which modern Germany and much of Europe built their systems of law and statehood. What they created in the 12th and 13th centuries continued to evolve long after their castles fell silent, echoing in the codes, courts, and emblems that still shape national identity today. At the heart of the Stauffer achievement was their approach to law. Before their time, the German lands were governed by a mix of customary rules, feudal obligations, and ecclesiastical decrees. Authority was scattered, and justice often depended on the will of local lords or bishops. The Stauffers sought to transform this fragmented landscape into a more unified legal order. They believed that the emperor, as God's chosen representative on earth, bore the duty to uphold justice across the realm. This belief gave rise to an idea that would later become central to modern governance: that law stands above personal interest and binds both ruler and subject alike. In practice, they began to formalize the processes through which justice was administered, setting precedents that would shape the evolution of German legal thought for centuries. Frederick Barbarossa saw law not as an abstract concept, but as a living instrument of power and stability. Under his reign, imperial courts became more structured, and legal professionals gained prominence in government service. He issued charters and decrees that sought to define the rights and duties of vassals, towns, and clergy, providing written clarity where previously only custom had reigned. This move toward documentation was revolutionary. It transformed justice from something personal and negotiable into something that could be referred to, studied, and enforced. Barbarossa's emphasis on written law also reflected the growing influence of Roman legal scholarship, which was being revived at universities such as Bologna. The rediscovery of Roman jurisprudence, with its emphasis on codified statutes and rational interpretation, resonated deeply with the Staufers' desire for order. Their blending of imperial authority with Roman legal reasoning laid the groundwork for the German conception of the state as a legal entity. The Staufer rulers did not merely adopt Roman law, they adapted it to the realities of the empire. Barbarossa's court sought to reconcile the universal claims of imperial authority with the local customs of the German lands. This balancing act produced a flexible yet coherent approach to governance. His legal advisors, often trained scholars, drafted texts that reflected both classical principles and medieval conditions. The emperor's decrees began to use the language of universal law, portraying the ruler as a guardian of justice for all his subjects, not just a feudal overlord. This concept, though rooted in the medieval world, foreshadowed the modern idea of a constitutional order in which power is exercised through established laws rather than through arbitrary will. Frederick II carried this vision to new heights. His reign in Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire marked one of the earliest examples of a government consciously organized around legal principles. His constitutions of Melfi, issued in the 13th century, codified the rights of subjects, regulated trade, and defined the limits of noble and clerical power. These laws were written in clear, systematic form and applied equally across his territories. They represented an effort to create uniform justice in an age of diversity. Although originally intended for his southern kingdom, the spirit of this legal code resonated across his empire and influenced how later rulers thought about governance. In German territories, his insistence on codification inspired local princes and cities to formalize their own laws, a process that continued throughout the late Middle Ages. The legal culture that the Staufers nurtured did not vanish when their dynasty fell. Instead, it became embedded in the habits of governance that characterized the empire for centuries. The idea that rulers must govern through written law found expression in later imperial reforms, such as the Golden Bull of the 14th century, which formalized the procedures for electing emperors and established clear constitutional principles. The respect for legal form, precision, and hierarchy that the Staufers had encouraged became part of German administrative life. Even as the empire fragmented into autonomous states, this shared legal heritage provided a thread of continuity. It fostered a sense that legitimacy rested not only on blood or force, but on lawful authority. When modern Germany began to form in the 19th century, jurists and reformers looked back to this medieval legacy for inspiration. The codification of civil law, the emphasis on a rational and structured legal system, and the belief that the state exists to maintain justice all echoed the principles first articulated under the Staufers. The German Civil Code, introduced centuries later, reflected a continuity of thought that valued clarity, logic, and universality, qualities that the Staufer emperors had sought in their own governance. Their insistence that authority must serve law, rather than law serving authority, remained a guiding ideal in the evolution of modern German jurisprudence. Beyond the realm of law, the Staufers' concept of centralized power left a deep imprint on the political imagination of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire under their rule was not a nation-state in the modern sense, but it embodied an idea that would later shape nation-building across the continent. The Staufers envisioned an empire that transcended local divisions and bound its people through loyalty to a higher, unified order. In their eyes, the emperor was not merely a German king, but a ruler of Christendom, a universal sovereign whose authority derived from divine and historical legitimacy. This conception of centralized power, tempered by law, laid the philosophical foundation for later efforts to unify diverse territories under a single government. Frederick Barbarossa was particularly adept at using ceremony and symbolism to project this imperial vision. His coronations, public appearances, and decrees all reinforced the notion that imperial authority flowed from an unbroken lineage stretching back to ancient Rome. The use of Roman imagery, the eagle, the crown, the orb, served to connect his rule with the grandeur of antiquity. Yet this was more than vanity. It was a deliberate attempt to give the empire a sense of coherence and destiny. The imperial idea, as the Staufers developed it, suggested that unity was possible not through conquest alone, but through shared purpose under a lawful ruler. This ideal survived the collapse of their dynasty and continued to influence political thought in the centuries that followed. Frederick II's interpretation of the imperial idea was even more sophisticated. He saw the empire as a rational organism, an entity that could be governed through laws, institutions, and knowledge. His emphasis on administration, scholarship, and communication made him one of the first rulers to understand that power depends on information and organization. The emperor, in his view, was both a monarch and a custodian of civilization. His court functioned as a center of policy and intellect, linking governance with enlightenment. This blending of political authority and cultural mission became a hallmark of later European monarchies. The notion that a ruler should embody both the state and its moral purpose can be traced, in part, to the example set by the Staufers. The idea of the empire as a unifying framework persisted long after the medieval structure itself disintegrated. When later German thinkers and politicians sought to define national identity, they often turned to the Staufer model of strong, lawful authority. The vision of an empire that balanced unity with diversity found new expression in the federal systems of later centuries. The dream of a centralized yet lawful power, capable of harmonizing local autonomy with collective strength, echoed through the debates that shaped the unification of Germany in the 19th century. Even though the modern German nation was built on principles of citizenship rather than divine right, the underlying belief in order, discipline, and unity had deep roots in the medieval imperial tradition. The Staufer vision also influenced other European states. Monarchies in France, Spain, and England drew lessons from the balance between centralized power and legal order that characterized their rule. The concept of a sovereign ruler, whose legitimacy rested on both divine sanction and legal rationality, helped bridge the medieval and modern worlds. By shaping how authority was imagined, the Staufers contributed to the evolution of political thought that made modern nation-states possible. Their empire was not a blueprint for nationalism, but it was a model of how diverse communities could coexist within a larger political and moral framework. While the legal and political ideas of the Staufers shaped the structure of governance, their symbols continued to shape the imagination. Even centuries after their fall, the imagery of their empire remains woven into German identity. The double-headed eagle, the imperial crown, and the red beard of Barbarossa became enduring emblems of authority and unity. These symbols, drawn from their reign, continued to reappear in art, literature, and political iconography, carrying layers of meaning that adapted to each new era. The double-headed eagle, originally adopted from Byzantine heraldry, became one of the most recognizable symbols of imperial power in Europe. Under the Staufers, it represented the idea of dual authority, the emperor's dominion over both church and state, the temporal and the spiritual. As time passed, the eagle evolved into a broader emblem of sovereignty. The Holy Roman Empire maintained it as its coat of arms for centuries, and even after the empire's dissolution, it found new life in the emblems of Austria, Russia, and later Germany. Its endurance reflects the lasting power of the Staufer image of rule, vigilant, balanced, and unifying. The imperial crown, too, became a symbol of continuity. Crafted in gold and adorned with precious stones, it embodied not only wealth, but also the sacred nature of kingship. The Staufers used it to assert their legitimacy and to connect their rule with the divine. Over time, the crown became more than a physical object. It became a metaphor for lawful authority and moral duty. When the German Empire was proclaimed in the 19th century, the new rulers drew consciously on the imagery of the old empire, invoking the memory of Barbarossa and the grandeur of the Staufers. In this way, medieval iconography continued to lend symbolic legitimacy to modern political forms. Perhaps no symbol from the Staufer age captured the public imagination as deeply as the legend of Frederick Barbarossa himself. According to folklore, he did not die but sleeps within a mountain, waiting for the day when Germany will need him again. His red beard, said to have grown through the stone table before him, signifies both timelessness and patience. This myth took hold during the Romantic revival of the 19th century, when writers and artists rediscovered the medieval past as a source of national inspiration. The Kyffhäuser monument, erected in his honor, fused the image of Barbarossa with that of modern unifiers, suggesting an unbroken line from medieval empire to modern nation. Even today, the legend continues to resonate as a symbol of endurance, unity, and hope. In contemporary Germany, traces of Staufer imagery remain visible in architecture, heraldry, and public memory. The imperial eagle still appears on the national emblem, a reminder of the deep historical roots of sovereignty. The castles built during their reign, from Hohenstaufen to Castel del Monte, draw scholars and tourists alike, not only as relics of medieval architecture, but as symbols of the enduring relationship between power and imagination. Museums and universities continue to study their legal codes, their art, and their vision of empire, recognizing in them the origins of many modern institutions. The Staufer name itself has become shorthand for a period of creativity, reform, and ambition that helped shape the identity of Central Europe. Yet the true significance of their legacy lies not only in symbols or institutions, but in the ideas they embodied. The Staufers understood that power must be bound by law, that unity must coexist with diversity, and that authority must be justified through both intellect and justice. These principles, forged in the crucible of medieval politics, remain relevant in the modern world. The German legal system's precision, the nation's respect for institutional continuity, and its cautious balance between federal autonomy and national unity all bear traces of the Staufer heritage. Their belief that governance is a craft requiring wisdom as well as strength continues to inform the German approach to statehood. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the Staufers appear not as relics of a distant age, but as participants in a long conversation about law and power that still continues. They lived in a world of knights and bishops, yet they grappled with questions that remain central today. How can justice restrain authority? How can unity respect difference? How can a ruler wield power without losing legitimacy? Their answers were imperfect, shaped by the limitations of their time, but they pointed the way toward modern political order. The empire they built and the laws they crafted stand as early attempts to harmonize freedom with authority, vision with restraint. The echoes of the Staufer age are thus not confined to history books or museum walls. They are felt in the quiet logic of legal codes, in the enduring symbols of the state, and in the collective memory of a people who continue to seek balance between order and idealism. Their empire may have fallen, but the ideas it nurtured became part of the enduring architecture of European civilization. The Staufers taught that law gives power its meaning, and that justice gives empire its soul. Their vision, once born of medieval ambition, still guides the modern world toward the same eternal goal: the pursuit of rightful order in the service of humanity. The influence of the Staufer dynasty runs far deeper than the political and legal structures they left behind. While their empire eventually crumbled, the traces of their rule remained imprinted in the very fabric of European civilization. Their unseen influence continued to shape culture, language, identity, architecture, and education, often in ways that people centuries later would not even recognize as Staufer in origin. The dynasty's ambition to unify and elevate the German lands did not end with their fall. It lingered through the words people spoke, the buildings they erected, and the schools they built. Their ideals, refined through centuries of change, became quiet but enduring forces that guided the development of German society. The story of how the Staufers helped shape early German linguistic and national identity begins with their understanding of communication as power. During their reign, Latin remained the language of the church, scholarship, and diplomacy. Yet the Staufers ruled a realm where many dialects coexisted, each rooted in local custom and tradition. To govern effectively, they needed not only military might and administrative skill, but also a way to speak to their subjects in a voice that transcended regional barriers. What emerged under their rule was the gradual elevation of the German vernacular from a spoken medium of daily life into a language of record, poetry, and eventually collective consciousness. Frederick Barbarossa's chancery, while maintaining Latin for formal documents, occasionally adopted vernacular expressions when dealing with local laws or urban charters. This acknowledgement of the people's tongue, though limited, was revolutionary for its time. It helped sow the seeds of a shared linguistic identity among regions that had long existed in isolation from one another. Words that appeared in official use began to acquire prestige, and people began to see their own speech reflected in the institutions that governed them. This subtle linguistic recognition fostered a sense of belonging that transcended feudal divisions. In the courts of Swabia and Austria, the cultural movement of the Minnesänger, the poet-musicians of the medieval German world, found fertile ground under Staufer patronage. These poets wrote in a refined version of Middle High German, crafting verses that celebrated chivalry, love, and honor. Their art was not only entertainment, but a declaration that the German language could carry beauty, emotion, and sophistication equal to that of Latin or Provençal. Figures such as Walther von der Vogelweide, whose career flourished during the Staufer age, captured the growing awareness of a shared cultural identity. Through song and verse, they helped turn spoken dialects into a medium of national expression. The linguistic unity that began under the Staufers developed slowly but steadily. It influenced later writers and thinkers who sought to define what it meant to be German. The early use of vernacular in law, poetry, and administration created a precedent for later generations to follow. When the Protestant Reformation came centuries later, Martin Luther's decision to translate the Bible into German rested on linguistic traditions that could trace their roots to this earlier period of recognition and refinement. The idea that a people could share a language, and that this language could express their collective faith and destiny, had its earliest stirrings in the cultural policies of the Staufers. Language was only one part of the identity the Staufers helped shape. Their rule also nurtured a sense of belonging that went beyond loyalty to local lords or tribes. The empire they envisioned was not merely a political structure. It was an attempt to give coherence to a people scattered across mountains, forests, and river valleys. By encouraging trade, law, and education across regions, they created networks that connected individuals who might otherwise have remained strangers. The imperial idea gave these connections a moral and cultural framework. It offered the promise of unity under shared values, justice, learning, and faith, that would continue to define German identity long after the empire itself faded. Their influence can also be read in stone. The architectural legacy of the Staufers remains one of the most visible reminders of their presence. From the fortresses that crown the hills of Swabia to the cathedrals that rise over the Rhine, their buildings continue to shape the German landscape. These structures were not only defensive or devotional, they were expressions of a worldview. The Staufers saw architecture as a means of communicating authority, beauty, and order. Every tower and portal reflected their conviction that power should have permanence and that faith should be made visible in form and proportion. The great cathedrals built or expanded during their reign, such as those at Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, embodied this synthesis of power and piety. Their massive stone walls and soaring arches were meant to convey both the might of the empire and the majesty of divine creation. The Romanesque style that dominated early in their rule evolved into the early Gothic, with its emphasis on height, light, and harmony. This transition mirrored the intellectual and spiritual ambitions of the age. The Staufers supported these projects not merely as acts of devotion, but as declarations of continuity between heaven and earth, between the eternal and the temporal. Their castles, too, were more than military outposts. Hohenstaufen, the ancestral seat of the dynasty, stood as both a fortress and a symbol of lineage. Built on a mountain overlooking the surrounding lands, it represented the dynasty's strength and its watchful guardianship over its people. Further south, Frederick II's Castel del Monte in Italy remains one of the most enigmatic buildings of the medieval world. Its geometric perfection, with 8 towers forming an octagonal shape around a central courtyard, reveals a mind fascinated by symmetry, reason, and the blending of art with science. The building's design reflects a worldview that saw order in mathematics and beauty in structure, a testament to the intellectual curiosity that defined the Staufer spirit. In the German heartlands, their architectural influence spread through both religious and secular construction. Monasteries, town halls, and bridges from this period bear the marks of Staufer patronage and style. The empire's building projects encouraged craftsmanship and innovation, uniting masons, sculptors, and engineers from different regions. The result was a shared architectural language that helped bind the empire culturally even when it was divided politically. The vaults, columns, and carvings that adorned these buildings became visual metaphors for stability and faith. Many of them still stand today, silent witnesses to an age that sought to harmonize faith with reason, tradition with progress. The architectural legacy of the Staufers also influenced how communities organized their physical spaces. Towns that developed under their rule often reflected careful planning, with marketplaces, churches, and administrative buildings forming clear centers of civic life. This orderliness in design symbolized their vision of governance, a world where every part had its purpose and harmony arose from structure. The medieval German city, with its concentric walls and defined civic spaces, owes much to the principles established during their reign. Over time, these urban patterns evolved into the orderly layouts that would characterize German towns for centuries, reinforcing a cultural preference for balance and precision. Beyond language and architecture, the Staufers left another enduring mark through their patronage of education. They ruled at a time when Europe was awakening to a new hunger for knowledge, fueled by contact with the Islamic world and the rediscovery of classical learning. The Staufers recognized that knowledge was a form of power, one that could strengthen both governance and culture. They supported schools, scholars, and the translation of texts, turning their courts into centers of intellectual exchange. Frederick II, in particular, understood the value of learning as few rulers of his time did. His court in Sicily was a meeting place of cultures: Latin, Greek, Arab, and Jewish. There, scholars studied philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and law. Under his patronage, works of Aristotle were translated into Latin, bridging the gap between ancient thought and medieval inquiry. He encouraged empirical observation and debate, insisting that knowledge should be tested rather than accepted on faith alone. In a time when superstition often ruled over reason, his attitude was revolutionary. His interest in science and his willingness to question established authority foreshadowed the intellectual spirit of later centuries. The universities that would later rise in Germany and across Europe found their earliest inspiration in this environment of curiosity and scholarship. The cathedral schools and monastic centers that flourished under the Staufers served as precursors to the great universities of Heidelberg, Leipzig, and Cologne. The idea that learning should be institutionalized, that scholars should gather to teach and debate, grew from the culture they nurtured. Their support for education was not limited to theology. It extended to law, medicine, and the natural sciences. By legitimizing the pursuit of knowledge as a royal and divine duty, they helped lay the groundwork for the academic traditions that became central to European identity. In the German lands, the emphasis on legal and administrative training established under the Staufers contributed directly to the later development of universities focused on jurisprudence. The need for educated officials to serve in imperial and local administrations led to the establishment of schools where law and governance were taught systematically. The rational and methodical approach that characterized Staufer administration found a lasting home in German education. Over time, this approach evolved into a broader intellectual tradition that valued structure, discipline, and critical reasoning, qualities that would become defining features of the German university system. Their legacy in education also had a social dimension. By promoting literacy and learning among clerics and laymen alike, the Staufers helped open paths of advancement based on merit rather than birth. The rise of educated officials and scholars under their rule foreshadowed the gradual emergence of a professional class that would later shape modern Europe. This democratization of knowledge, limited though it was in scope, marked an important step toward the more inclusive societies of later centuries. The belief that knowledge could serve the common good, that learning was a means of improving both the individual and the community, was one of the most progressive ideas to emerge from their era. The influence of Staufer patronage of learning can still be felt in the modern world. Germany's reputation as a center of scholarship and innovation owes much to the foundations laid during this time. The respect for education as a pillar of national identity, the emphasis on rigorous study, and the belief in the transformative power of knowledge all trace their lineage to the intellectual environment the Staufers helped create. Their vision of a world governed by both reason and law continues to shape the ethos of German universities, where research and responsibility are seen as intertwined. When viewed together, language, architecture, and education, the Staufer legacy forms a coherent pattern of cultural evolution. They helped transform a fragmented collection of tribes and territories into a civilization with shared symbols, language, and intellectual ambition. Their unseen influence lies in the way they connected the spiritual with the material, the abstract with the practical. Through their laws, they brought order. Through their architecture, they gave that order form. Through their support of learning, they gave it meaning. Even centuries after their fall, their imprint remains. The German language, refined and enriched through the centuries, still carries echoes of the words that once filled their courts and charters. The cities that grew under their influence retain their medieval cores, where cathedrals and marketplaces stand as reminders of their vision. The universities that flourish today, bastions of inquiry and debate, trace their ancestry to the culture of learning they fostered. Each of these elements, language, architecture, education, reveals how the Staufers shaped not just their own age, but the very identity of the lands they ruled. In the modern era, when Germany stands as a nation defined by precision, creativity, and learning, it is possible to see the distant reflection of Staufer ideals. Their belief in the harmony of structure and imagination, their commitment to justice and knowledge, and their respect for both tradition and progress created patterns that history would continue to follow. The Staufers may no longer rule, but the society they helped to mold continues to live by the principles they cherished: the power of words, the permanence of form, and the freedom of thought. In the quiet rhythm of the German language, in the solid grace of its cathedrals, and in the disciplined pursuit of knowledge that defines its universities, the legacy of the Staufers endures. Their influence, though unseen, continues to bind past and present in a continuous dialogue of aspiration and achievement. Through their vision, the idea of a just, learned, and united society took root, a vision that remains alive in the soul of modern Germany, as enduring as the stones of their castles and as eloquent as the words of their poets. The Staufer legacy, after centuries of silence, has never truly disappeared. It has lingered in chronicles, in the stones of cathedrals, in the rhythm of German speech, and in the disciplined spirit of learning that has shaped modern Europe. Yet in recent decades, there has been a new stirring, a revival of curiosity and admiration for the dynasty that once sought to unite heaven and earth under a vision of order and enlightenment. The fascination with the Staufers today is not merely academic or nostalgic. It arises from a deeper recognition that their story speaks directly to the modern world, offering lessons about ambition, leadership, and the enduring tension between power and principle. The rediscovery of their era has become more than an exercise in medieval scholarship. It has become a mirror through which people can understand both their past and their present. This revival began gradually, as historians, archaeologists, and cultural scholars started to re-examine the Staufer period with new methods and fresh perspectives. Earlier generations of historians often judged the dynasty through the lens of later national movements, interpreting them as precursors to a unified Germany or, conversely, as failed dreamers whose ambitions outpaced reality. Modern research has moved beyond such narrow interpretations. It views the Staufers as part of a broader European transformation, where the boundaries between faith and reason, empire and identity, were being redrawn. This shift in understanding has opened the way for a deeper appreciation of their contributions, not only to politics and warfare, but to culture, governance, and the human spirit. Archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to this picture. Excavations at former Staufer sites have revealed intricate fortifications, refined architectural details, and artifacts that illustrate the sophistication of their craftsmanship. Digital reconstructions of castles such as Hohenstaufen and Castel del Monte allow modern audiences to walk virtually through spaces that once embodied imperial authority. These reconstructions reveal that the Staufers were not merely builders of stone but of ideas. Ideas about symmetry, order, and beauty that continue to inspire architects and artists today. The study of their urban projects, from the careful planning of towns to the development of trade centers, shows how they laid the foundations for the modern European city. In universities across Europe, renewed attention to the Staufers has sparked interdisciplinary research. Historians study their political reforms alongside linguists who trace how their courts influenced the evolution of the German language. Art historians examine the symbolism of their iconography, while legal scholars explore how their reforms anticipated modern systems of governance. This growing body of work reflects a collective fascination with how one dynasty, ruling for little more than a century, could exert an influence that still resonates across time. Conferences, museum exhibitions, and public lectures dedicated to the Staufer age attract scholars and enthusiasts alike. These events show how history, when examined closely, can breathe again, reminding people that even distant centuries remain part of their shared cultural fabric. The fascination also extends beyond academia. In Germany and Italy, where many of the dynasty's monuments still stand, the Staufers have become symbols of continuity and creativity. Tourism centered around their heritage draws visitors to medieval cities, cathedrals, and castles. Local festivals celebrate the memory of their reign with pageantry and music, blending scholarship with popular culture. These commemorations are not just nostalgic reenactments. They are expressions of regional pride and cultural identity. They remind communities that their landscapes and traditions are shaped by a past that remains alive in their architecture and collective memory. Part of the modern appeal of the Staufers lies in their paradoxical nature. They were rulers of immense ambition, yet their vision extended beyond mere conquest. They sought to balance authority with learning, faith with inquiry, tradition with innovation. This complexity makes them deeply relevant to a world still struggling with similar tensions. The rediscovery of their era offers a chance to reflect on what leadership means and what kind of ambition truly endures. The lesson of the Staufer age begins with its understanding of power. For the Staufers, power was never only military or political, it was intellectual and moral as well. Frederick Barbarossa saw the empire as a sacred institution, one that bound ruler and subject in a moral order under divine law. His conception of kingship emphasized justice, responsibility, and the harmony of the human and divine realms. Although his efforts to enforce imperial authority often met with resistance from the papacy and local princes, his ideal of a ruler guided by both law and conscience set a standard that outlasted his reign. In a time when political authority often rested on brute strength, the Staufers articulated a vision of governance based on legitimacy and moral purpose. From Barbarossa's grandson, Frederick II, comes another set of lessons about intellect, tolerance, and the pursuit of knowledge. He ruled as both emperor and scholar, seeing wisdom as a tool of governance. His fascination with science, language, and philosophy reflected a mind that understood the power of ideas. In his court, he gathered thinkers from different cultures, promoting dialogue between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. This cosmopolitan spirit, rare in a deeply divided world, reminds modern society of the value of openness and exchange. Frederick's willingness to question established truths anticipated the spirit of inquiry that would later define the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. His legacy encourages people today to see curiosity not as a threat to authority, but as one of its most vital supports. The Staufer era also teaches that ambition can be both creative and destructive. Their dreams of unity often clashed with the realities of human nature and political complexity. Their attempts to centralize power brought them into conflict with the papacy, the Italian communes, and the German princes. These struggles reveal a timeless truth, that every vision of order carries within it the seeds of resistance. The tension between the ideal of unity and the reality of diversity remains as relevant now as it was in their time. In a world that continues to wrestle with globalization and identity, the Staufer story serves as a reminder that balance, not domination, is the key to lasting harmony. The lessons of their decline are as valuable as those of their rise. The fall of the Staufers demonstrates that even the most enlightened leadership can falter when it loses touch with the social and political currents that sustain it. Their downfall, brought about by the combined opposition of external enemies and internal divisions, underscores the fragility of power built on vision alone. Yet their failure was not a total loss. It left behind ideas that others would carry forward, the concept of the rule of law, the importance of education, and the belief that authority must serve justice. Their fall reminds modern societies that ideals can outlive institutions, and that influence is measured not by duration but by depth. Beyond these historical lessons lies a more personal connection, one that touches everyday life even in subtle ways. The world shaped by the Staufers continues to define the environment in which people live, learn, and think. Every time a person walks through a medieval German town with its carefully planned streets and towering church, they are walking through the physical legacy of Staufer urban design. The structure of these cities, with their balance between civic and spiritual spaces, reflects the same principles of harmony and order that guided Staufer governance. The sense of proportion and clarity that characterizes modern German architecture has roots in the symmetry and logic of their constructions. Language, too, carries their legacy. The German spoken today evolved through centuries of refinement that began when the Staufers first elevated the vernacular in law and literature. The clarity, discipline, and precision for which the German language is known can trace part of its heritage to that formative period when poets and officials began to see their native tongue as a vehicle of thought and culture. Every word written or spoken in that language today carries an echo of those early efforts to make it a tool of unity and identity. The influence extends to education and intellectual life. The modern European university, with its emphasis on structured debate, empirical reasoning, and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, owes much to the intellectual climate the Staufers fostered. When students gather in lecture halls to question, analyze, and discover, they participate, however unknowingly, in a tradition that began in the courts and schools the Staufers supported. The respect for learning as a civic virtue, the belief that knowledge enriches both the individual and society, remains one of their most enduring gifts. Even the modern sense of law and governance bears their imprint. The Staufer emphasis on codified laws and fair administration helped establish patterns that shaped later legal systems in the German lands. The idea that power must be balanced by justice, that authority derives its legitimacy from service to the public good, continues to underpin democratic governance. Whenever citizens demand accountability, transparency, or equality before the law, they echo principles that found early expression in Staufer reforms. The arts, too, still reflect their influence. The Staufers' commitment to artistic patronage helped create a culture where creativity was valued as a reflection of divine order. This belief in the moral dimension of art continued through the Renaissance, the Baroque, and into modern aesthetics. In the balance and clarity of German design, in the reverence for craftsmanship and form, the spirit of Staufer artistry endures. It reminds the modern world that beauty and function are not opposites, but partners in expressing human purpose. Beyond these tangible influences, the Staufers offer a broader, almost philosophical lesson about how history shapes identity. Their story shows that progress is not linear, that civilizations rise and fall, yet each leaves traces that others can build upon. The modern rediscovery of their world reveals how the past continues to live within the present. It invites reflection on the continuity of human endeavor, how ambition, once directed toward empire, can find new expression in knowledge, culture, and creativity. The fascination with the Staufers today is therefore more than admiration for medieval grandeur. It is a search for meaning in a world that often feels fragmented and uncertain. Their age reminds people that the pursuit of order, justice, and understanding is timeless, that every generation must find its own way to reconcile power with purpose. The Staufers' combination of ambition and intellect provides a model for how vision and wisdom can coexist, even when history seems to conspire against them. In a broader sense, their legacy challenges modern societies to think about how power should be used. The Staufers believed that authority carried with it a duty to protect, to enlighten, and to elevate. They saw leadership not as possession but as stewardship. In an era where questions of governance, ethics, and responsibility remain pressing, their example encourages reflection on what it means to lead with integrity. Their empire may have been bound by feudal law and medieval faith, but the principles they embodied remain relevant. Justice over dominance, learning over ignorance, and unity over division. Perhaps the most profound connection to the Staufers lies in the human aspiration they represent. They remind people that ambition, when guided by wisdom, can build not only empires but civilizations of the mind and spirit. Their world was one of struggle and imperfection, yet out of it grew enduring ideals that continue to shape the values of modern life. The cathedrals they built were not just monuments to faith, but to the human capacity to dream of perfection. Their legal reforms were not just acts of control, but steps toward fairness. Their encouragement of learning was not merely policy, but an acknowledgement that knowledge is the true foundation of progress. Even in daily routines, the echo of their influence persists. When people rely on structured institutions, when they appreciate balance in design, when they value education as a path to opportunity, they are living within systems that trace back to the ideas the Staufers helped cultivate. Their influence has become so deeply woven into the cultural fabric that it feels natural, almost invisible. Yet it is there, in the very order of the world around us, in the values we hold, and in the ambitions we pursue. As the modern world continues to rediscover and reinterpret their legacy, the Staufers stand as more than a historical dynasty. They represent a vision of human potential. The belief that power can serve wisdom, that learning can sustain justice, and that beauty can reflect truth. Their story bridges the distance between medieval and modern, reminding us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation. Through that conversation, their spirit endures, guiding reflection on how ambition can be turned toward lasting good. The Staufers belong not only to the past, but to the future. Their ideals, order, learning, and justice, remain essential to any society that seeks meaning beyond power and permanence beyond conquest. Their unseen influence continues to shape how people think, build, and aspire. To know them is not simply to remember a dynasty, but to recognize the roots of our own civilization. The Staufers' vision, once carved in stone and written in law, now lives in the structures, languages, and minds of those who carry forward their dream of harmony between knowledge and power. Through every cathedral that stands, every law that upholds justice, and every mind that seeks understanding, their legacy continues, a legacy not only for history but for tomorrow.